Welcome to the first real video on the Mori G37X channel, and today I'll be returning my hot air intakes into a set of cold air intakes. Well, hopefully that is. Obviously at the current moment these intakes are just sucking in hot air when the car is stationary, since they are not shielded from the engine. And in the end, this is what they should hopefully look like. While these intakes don't have many good qualities, the one thing I do like is the induction noise. So with these heat shields, I want to be able to retain as much of this intake noise as possible while making the intake temps cooler. To start off, I made some small templates with paper that went over the top of the intakes before I started recording. After that, I then transferred the paper templates onto some cardboard to make a semi-rigid prototype. After that, I then used a compass to make a rough outline for where the intake tubes should go through. After I finished making the rough template for the backing plate, I then moved on to working on the car, since that would be the most important part next. Now with the backing plate in, I can start working on the base plate. Since this is going to have to do the most amount of work, since I'm having to cut around the AC lines and around the original intake guides, this part took quite a little bit of time. Once I got the base plate cut to the correct shape, I then taped it to the backing plate and then made the piece that would be closest to the radiator shroud. And I also made sure to make some small provisions so that the fuse box for all the alarm systems could still fit. Next is to make sure that the heat shield won't interfere with the hood closing. So I rested the hood just above the latches and shined a flashlight into it to see where I would need to trim the back plate. After a few attempts of trimming, I got to a point where the hood had no issue closing, but I put some tape on the top edge of the shield to see if there was still any contact. After that, I taped the side piece to the base and back plate, and then used my phone to record the inside of the engine bay to see where there were any gaps left. With the driver's side template done, I then made a template for the passenger side of the car, which was a little more difficult since I had to factor in the upper radiator outlet and the power steering reservoir. And lastly, before transferring the templates to the metal that I'll use to make the heat shields, I made holes for the intake piping to make sure that the pipes would fit. Now the holes for the tubing are a little on the large side, but I'll make them smaller on the actual finished product. And here's the finished product, or at least what I call version 1. In the end, I did end up forgetting to record me cutting and assembling the heat shields together, which is unfortunate. For materials on these heat shields, I ended up just buying some cheap aluminum that I ended up finding on Home Depot, along with some rubber trim. As for mounting the heat shields, I used the two outer bolts on the rad support and used a 10mm bolt on the strut tower on the driver's side. As for the passenger side, I used the same rad support bolt, but also used one of the bolts from the power steering reservoir bracket. For the overall design of the heat shields, I ended up trying to make them a one-piece design, but cut the base plate separately and used some L brackets with rivets to secure the pieces together. Now, one of the unfortunate drawbacks of these heat shields not being a full one-piece design is the gaps between the aluminum sheets. Unfortunately, this means that there's a high chance of hot air getting in between these gaps. And after completing the install on the heat shields, I went for the first short drive with the new heat shields on, but things didn't go well. Unfortunately, the low pressure oil light came up on the dash not even 5 minutes after I started driving. Now, this light could mean multiple different things, such as a bad oil pressure switch or that the screws backed out on the gallery gasket itself. But when I ended up draining the oil, there was a considerable amount of metal in it. And when I dipped my fingers into the oil and rubbed them together, it felt like I was rubbing my fingers on sandpaper. So even though I didn't get a full diagnosis on the issue, I decided just to swap in a used motor since I don't want the engine failing with my future plans. And when I was pulling the car into the garage for the final time before the swap, I heard a very audible knocking from the passenger side of the engine. Also, my original plan was to make a video on the swap, but I didn't end up recording enough to make a full video, but do have some video here, which I'll use as some overlay. Considering this was my first time swapping an engine by myself on my own car, it actually ended up going decently well. And for any VQ owners, while you're in there, I highly recommend replacing the heater hose connection since they are a common failure point. Thankfully, I found a relatively low mileage engine on eBay, so I was able to buy that and have it shipped directly to my house for the swap. And for my swap in particular, I pulled the transmission with the engine since it was a pain to get to the torque converter bolts. And stupidly enough, I ended up doing this swap during the middle of winter in Colorado, which is a stupid idea, because for some reason this winter it ended up being extremely cold, and by that I mean it was in the negatives or the single digits every day I worked on the damn car. Also, if you plan on doing any VQ swaps in the near future, I highly recommend getting the VQ lift plate from Olmidis Motorsports. And I'm not sponsored by them, obviously, but I found it extremely helpful since it was my first time swapping an engine. And after I got the car back up and running, I decided to make some changes to the heat shields since I did a piss poor job of designing them. Thankfully, I still had enough aluminum left over to completely remake the heat shields, and by some miracle, I ended up actually recording me cutting the aluminum sheets. For version 2 of the heat shields, I made them cover a larger area of the engine bay around the intake filters, and the most important thing was that I made them into a true one-piece design, so that there would be almost no or very little holes for hot air to get in between. And along the other revisions that I made to the heat shields, I also made some covers to go over the top of the intake filters. Now, to disassemble the heat shields, I ended up using some aluminum or silver heat tape from DEI. For a majority of the heat shields, I only used them on the areas where there were some small gaps between the one-piece designs and bends. And at the last minute before I installed the heat shields, I did cover the entire outside of the heat shields with the same DEI heat tape as I mentioned earlier.
We must pay homage to him.
Now I can truly say that this is the true final product. As you can see, I ended up extending both the driver and passenger side heat shields out closer towards the engine. And for bracketry, I switched to using one of the hood latch bolts while still using the power steering bracket bolt on the passenger side. And on the driver's side, I just added the hood latch bolt, but still used the two original mounting places. Unfortunately, I did end up making it on the driver's side to where the alarm fuse box does not fit anymore, just because I accidentally made the intake tubing a little too far to the outside of the car. And one of the revisions that I made to the base plate was that I ended up extending it into the area where the original intake air guides go. So hopefully this small revision should help the intakes get colder air on a more consistent basis. And finally, to mount the covers that I made, I placed some magnets on the airbox and the top to secure it. Obviously, these covers are not perfect and probably will never be, but they are much better than the previous design. Now for actual data. For this, I ended up just data logging the intake air temps with these new designs, but it ended up seeming roughly about a 10-degree difference between ambient air temp and the intake air temp. Granted, it is fair to say that these results could be a little bit skewed, since during the week that I did a majority of this testing, we got heavy rain where I live. So it ended up making it to where the intake air temps seemed maybe a little cooler than they might have been on normal driving conditions. Well, that's all that I have for this video, but I do have a few coming up soon, so if you want to see more G37 content, make sure to subscribe, and thank you for watching.